Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's HDI webinar, IT Change Management in a High-Speed World. Today's webinar is brought to you by Service Management World. Be there for what's next. There's a link to the conference website in the Attachments tab on your BrightTalk window. So take a look at that, and we hope to see you there. You can connect with HDI on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, in our discussion board site, HDI Connect, and we have a podcast called Spockcast on iTunes and SoundCloud. I'm Roy Atkinson, HDI Senior Writer and Analyst, and I'm your moderator today. Our featured speaker today is Greg Sanker. Greg is the author of IT Change Management, A Practitioner's Guide, and a frequent blogger, speaker, and presenter, and is also the CIO of the Oregon Department of Administrative Services. Greg has decades of global IT experience with organizations ranging from a Fortune 10 tech giant to the public sector. He's one of HDI's top 25 thought leaders. We just have a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. If you are experiencing any technical problems, refresh your browser. It is the best possible thing you could do. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the webcast. They'll be answered during Q&A session toward the end of the webcast as time permits. You can download the slides, as some of you already have, from today's presentation by opening the Attachments tab on your BrightTalk screen, and be sure to check out the links you'll find there as well. There will be an audience poll, and you can respond in the Vote tab on your presentation window. Remember that today's webinar will be available on demand shortly after the completion of this live webcast, and you'll receive an email reminder that it is available. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. And before we start our discussion today, we do have a poll question for you. So I'm going to launch that poll, and we're going to collect your answers. So we'll have a little discussion point at the beginning. And the question is, in your organization, it says in our organization, so from your standpoint, we think of change management or change control as a necessary step in good governance, a roadblock that stops us, an unnecessary impediment in getting things done, a bottleneck, or a change enabler. Which is the closest to the way that you think about change management or change control in your organization? Enter your votes, and we'll take a look at what you think. And in a couple of minutes, we'll just leave that up so you can vote, and then we'll look at the results. So far, we're 50-50. I won't tell you which is which. And we'll leave you a little bit more time to vote. You've got about 15 seconds or so. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop the voting, and we'll look at the results. So what we see is about 2/3 of you see change management and change control. Actually, last votes just popped in. Almost 3/4 of you see it as a necessary step in good governance. About 9% see it as a roadblock, and about 18% see it as a change enabler. So pretty good for what Greg Sanker is going to have to say. Greg, wouldn't you say?
I would say that's a really good distribution.
Okay. Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
All right. Well, thank you, Roy. So hopefully you see in front of you the slides. Why change control? Why do we need to change controls? And as I put in their subline, haven't we done away with this archaic thought? Which is something that I hear quite a lot. We don't need change. We don't need to manage changes. And like this group pointed out, however, it's part of our good governance process. And it's part of enabling the organization to do things that really, really matter. So what I'm going to focus on here is good practices that have been there all along and are now highlighted or amplified in version 4 of ITIL and good practice in organizations around the world. So let's take a look. So let's talk about, first of all, change control versus change management. Change management is what we've been calling this thing for years and years and years. And unfortunately, it causes some confusion in the industry between change management and organizational change management. In many contexts, when you say change management, many people think you're talking about the people side of change, the organizational management, and so that causes some confusion. But more importantly, to kind of my point here, is that there's a subtle implication that we're talking about managing each and every change when we talk about change management, and that the focus is on this change going through the process from end to end. And there seems to be a fair amount of emphasis on the process piece of it, of managing changes. And so that's one of the reasons that we're moving forward to change control as an industry, and where we're more focused on controlling the circumstances in which changes are being produced in the organization. And we're wanting to make sure that all changes are happening within control limits that are defined by the organization. And I'm going to have a lot to say about that as we move on here. And we want to make sure that whatever we're doing with regard to change, that it's adaptive, that it's learning, and that it's being optimized not just for the organization, but for the individual areas of the organization that are producing changes. One size fits all simply isn't appropriate anymore. And then, of course, we have to focus on the business value. Change management or change control can no longer operate as strictly a let's make sure we don't screw something up in production. It has to focus on the business value that's tied up in the changes that we implement within the organization. Well, last minute change here, before ITIL 4 got released, they have renamed it to Change Enablement. And the reason that that's kind of the thought process is the focus is not just controlling or command and control or all of those kind of rigid process kind of thought process, but really it's about making changes that the organization needs, making them happen in a timely and effective manner. And that's what we talk about when we talk about change enablement. The rest of the presentation, because I haven't edited it all, is going to talk about change control, and I talk about them relatively interchangeably. But just so you know, that's kind of where the thought process is there. So let's talk about change control as a practice. What is it? And there's 5 important pieces that I've talked about in my book and is in the ITIL guidance, which is it's the capability that your organization or a practice, as we call it in ITIL, that seeks to do a couple of really important things. 5, timely and effective implementation of business-required changes, which is a lot. Timely and effective varies per organization. It might vary from time to time or change to change or areas of the business. And everything is focused on the business needing those things to be done. So it's not internally IT focused, but it's focused on what it is that we're doing for our business. And of course, we have to manage risk. And I think I want to point out early on in this presentation, the risk I'm talking about here is that's risk to the business that presents itself from changes to IT or systems or infrastructures or applications that the business is depending on. So when we talk about risk, we have to articulate that and understand that in the context of what's the risk to the business. And we also need to protect our business from negative impact, which is a little bit different than managing risk. Negative impact can be things like it went in and it didn't work. It could also be it didn't go in soon enough, and that has a negative impact on the business. And so there's kind of both sides of that negative impact piece. And then the other that's pretty new to a lot of folks that are been in change management for a while is that we are now accountable or responsible or have to have in our view that the business outcomes that the business had in mind are actually being achieved. So if we upgrade a system or patch a system or whatever, it's not okay just to say, well, we installed that and all is well and we move on, and the business hasn't seen any value or maybe negatively impact. I always talk about we upgrade your Office application suite and the change went successful, I'll go home and celebrate, but the business comes in the morning and they can't find their files, they can't print, they can't do their business. And so the desired business outcome was not achieved in that kind of a change. So we want to be sure that we're focused on our business and what they're trying to do. And lastly, but certainly not least, is the governance and compliance expectations that your organization either has or operates under need to be met. And usually it's called governance, risk, and compliance, and I've pulled that out up in bullet number 2. And that becomes really, really important. And I'm probably going to come back and say a little bit more about that down the road here just a little bit. Let me remind you, as I'm talking, if I say things that trigger questions, go ahead and enter them into the portal, and Roy's going to present them to me later on. And I'm going to try to save a fair amount of time because it's a topic that has a lot of questions usually with it. So let's talk about what change control is not. And these are a lot of things that I hear, complaints I hear levied at a traditional change practice, and that it is not a standalone process. It doesn't operate in isolation from the rest of the organization or the value streams that are producing changes, and it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. And the process or practice around managing changes is not CAB-centric. CAB is still a tool that we use, and it's certainly appropriate in many, many cases, but it is not the center of or the be-all, end-all of managing changes. It's also not process-centric. It's outcome-centric. So the focus is on what it is that we're achieving and to what degree we're achieving that, and not so much on are we following the process. And it's also not at odds with flow and high-velocity methodologies. And that's something I'm going to come back and say a little bit more. You hear a lot about DevOps and Agile and continuous integration and deployment, and these are important pieces of modern IT. And that's where we usually start facing challenges with what we're doing in change management. People contact me, send me an email saying, hey, I don't know what to do with these things. And that's a challenge because what we've regularly practiced in the change management world are kind of not suited for that. And that's why change control really is. It matches very well. We can't allow change control to be a roadblock. It's not a mother may I process, and it's not about power, process, command, and control. So I'm putting those things out there. If that's where your organization's at or where things are at, we have some maturing to do organizationally. Let's talk about the role of the CAB, though. That seems to be the center of a great saga of epic proportion that people love to debate hotly for and against that. So let's talk about the CAB. So in a traditional change management, somebody has an idea. This is a very abstracted thing because I don't want to dictate what your organization is doing, but you think about that. There's an idea. Something needs to be done. This needs to be upgraded. The customer wants this installed. The customer wants a feature added. Whatever it is, you recognize that at some point there's an idea that turns into an actual building process. We develop it. We craft it. Whatever we do, we get our routers updated or whatever those things are. But there's an idea that goes into a development practice, and eventually that goes into our production environment. And that's the basic elements in an organization of changes moving within the organization. And so traditional change management has fairly much focused in on this last piece here, is after you've developed it and before you move it into production, let's just stop and take a look. And as my friend always said, make sure we screw it in, don't screw it up. Right? And that's where traditional change management has been. Unfortunately, it's a fairly bureaucratic process because it kind of implies that every change needs to have a manual oversight or a manual review. It's also very reactive because it's not in that format engaged until after the development work is done and just before deployment. And it's also, I want you to think about this a little bit. It's also another cue where work stops. And if you think about any of the flow or lean or any of those kind of optimization kind of thought processes, you don't want work to stop and build up awaiting for something to happen. So if you have a weekly CAB or every other week or even a couple times a week, at a minimum, there's days, maybe a week, maybe more of wait before those can be reviewed. And that is tremendously at odds with modern development methodologies. And so that, as I point out, it doesn't mesh really well with those kind of things. So let's, anybody recognize this guy? I know I can't hear you responding, but this is W. Edwards Demings, and you might have heard about him. He had some bright ideas. And I documented some of them here, and they're fairly relevant to what we're trying to do in the world of change management or change control. He said we really need to get away from relying on mass inspection. By mass inspection, he means before you ship the product, whatever it is, make sure you check it. Is it all properly assembled? Does it work? Does it turn on? Does it do whatever? And that was a big thing in the early days of the Toyota production system, or the idea of engineering quality into everything that we're doing, that we don't inspect quality in, we engineer it into how we're doing it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. The other piece that is very cultural, and you'll find this very consistent with some of the ways of DevOps and some of the mindset around Agile and some of these other methodologies, is that quality is everybody's responsibility. And if you think of change control as a quality piece, then quality is not delegated to the cab or the people that are represented on the cab or even the individuals that are doing peer reviews or any other form of review of the change. It's everybody's responsibility everywhere within the organization. And the reason for that is because every piece is engaged in a change in one way or another. And the other piece that he said that I think is very poignant is that if you have a bad system, that bad system will win out over good people every time. And you know that in IT, we sometimes put an over-reliance on really good people that are compensating for some really bad practices. And unfortunately, according to Deming, those bad practices are really going to hurt you. So we want to get away from those kinds of things. Well, if we think about what that looks like, you think about this is a pipe and a faucet. Hopefully you recognize my cool graphics here. But the idea is that it flows down and the water faucet is closed, and we stop it right there, and nothing comes forward until we turn the faucet on and actually move it down the line here. So we really look at this, and here's what it looks like kind of from a stepwise or a process perspective is we're doing these things associated with developing changes and reviewing them and getting all the pieces of the organization. But unfortunately, everything comes to a grinding halt right here at the end and has to be inspected before we move it across over here and then ship it on down. And that is essentially what a traditional change management or change control practice was all about. And it's kind of problematic. So if we take a little closer look at it, it's you turn the faucet on and that's where the drip comes out, right? So let's take a different look at that. If we look upstream, or we go to the other end, which you might hear in terms of a shift left, let's look at a different pipe system, right? So in this pipe system, over here we have this mountaintop with snow on it, and from that we get our crystal clear water that everybody enjoys drinking. But what if there was something that was up here that was injecting into the system that wasn't particularly good? So the question that I have to ask that's not entirely philosophical is, how much good can we do here when there's something bad being injected into the system back here? And that's kind of the thought process around why we want to engage in the workflow. So this is where we start talking about, rather than focusing at the end out to the far right, we want to shift left and start looking at what's happening down here. So we want to understand the value stream. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But each change-producing value stream has its own set of parameters, its own kind of operating parameters. And we want to shift to the left to understand how that value stream is working over time. We want to understand how we're doing sprint or iteration or however we're planning our work at the beginning. We want to be engaged with that, and we want to be engaged with how work is flowing through the system rather than specifying. I've heard change managers say, I don't really care how you develop your changes, DevOps, whatever, if they just have to come to my cab before I will let you go into production. And that is very antithetical to what we're trying to do with flow within the organization, right? So let's talk about things that flow. Hopefully you recognize some of these as things that flow. And I'm using the term flow very, very intentionally. And there's my grand dog, Odin, and he's next to a clear mountain stream that, as you can see, it's flowing down the mountain. And what we don't have is water that's being transferred by bucket from one place to another or being diverted off. It is flowing continuously. And that's kind of a point of emphasis that we need to think about, is if we're slowing down the work, if we're impeding progress, then we're not so much enabling changes, but we're really focusing in simply on that QA perspective. So this graphic here talks about, in an organization, the work comes in, but we recognize that how we develop web applications or our mainframe applications or manage PC desktop support or any of those other things that we do, all of which have changes, are done through different, what we now call value streams. And so there's different methodologies, there's different people, there's different practices or approaches, and each one of those value streams is unique. And so this is where we get away from the one size. Found this on the freeway the other day. I actually took this picture while I was driving. So what you have here is a dump truck full of RFCs, if you look at the mud flaps there. And if all changes are bound to cab, if all roads lead to cab, what do we have at the cab? Well, you can probably guess we have a bit of a traffic jam. So it's not a scalable model, and that's part of the challenge that we face is we need an adaptive, scalable model that meets the needs of the organization. And so we need to get away from the one-size-fits-all or the big command and control practice and get towards an adaptive practice that's in the workflows. So let's talk about value streams. You likely recognize this graphic. You've seen it all over the internet. This is directly from Axelos and the ITIL version 4. And what this, I'm going to give a very simple version of this. What this talks about is through the organization, there is a value stream for each piece of value that's delivered to the customers. And it may be unique for different services or different ways of delivering value. But the idea is that the organization has a series of capabilities, a series of practices around which we can construct value-generating activities or value streams, right? So when it comes to changes, the goal here is that we have a demand or an opportunity here on the left-hand side, and that needs to be turned into something that the business finds valuable over here on the right. And one of the processes or practices for doing that is this thing called change control, or now change enablement. And the idea is that regardless of how those value streams are constructed, regardless of what the actual activities are of generating the value or producing the product or services that are being offered to the customer, is change control makes sure that those things that were demanded or those things that were required or necessary or the opportunity is delivered in terms of value. And value has multiple dimensions, as I know that you know. So this is kind of the fundamental idea of a value stream, and it's very much highlighted. So in this graphic, I'm going to talk a little bit about the various kind of, I don't want to call them maturity levels, but as our CAB moves or our change practice moves from a fundamental to a more advanced model, we start focusing on some different things. So at the wrench level, or the nuts and bolts level, there is a focus on individual RFCs, and it becomes a quality inspection point. Many of us are practicing this. Some of us recognize that we need to do this for governance reasons. But it's a bottleneck by design because everything comes to a grinding halt and has to go to some form of a review, and it tends to be activity versus outcome-based. We talked about this, right? But the next layer above that, as we start looking at value streams, we start looking at the change outcome performance of those individual value streams, and we're integrating with the workflow. So you see how we're kind of stepping up. The same group, the same function is now focusing on higher order things and less about the individual RFCs. And let me pause and emphasize just a little bit. As your change capability matures, you become increasingly focused on the end-to-end development of changes, the practice of bringing changes about, and less focused on individual changes in the form of an RFC or any other form of change. With the notable exception is some changes, we're going to talk about this as well, some changes have a massive risk or of such a magnitudinal size that you may assemble a team like a CAB or a release review or some other body that's relevant within your organization that actually focus on that particular change because it's so large. But most of the changes statistically, the preponderance of changes that are done in an organization are relatively small changes that are done relatively frequently, and those we want to flow through the organization. So when we get up here to the top, this is where we're really starting to focus in on business value, business outcomes, managing business risk, and we're trying to solve organizational problems, or we're part of solving problems at the organizational level that enables our business to be successful. So change, as you can see, it elevates from being nuts and bolts and very, very focused on the technical details of individual changes to how are those changes being developed and are we producing consistently high quality outcomes, all the way up to we're partnering with the business to make sure that they have what they need when they need it to be successful in the business. And at modern speed, that is critically important. A change capability becomes a strong enabler of organizational success, because missing a window for lots of business cycles can be deadly, especially to rapidly growing in industries that are emerging very, very rapidly. Is IT shops need to be able to meet that need for speed, as we like to call it. Okay, let's talk about enabling change, not inhibiting them. So this is when I start playing math professor, which I am not, but you understand that if you plot the results of anything that's observable, rolling the dice, what time of day a car passes, whatever those observable activities, you did this in high school math and statistics, and you plot them over time here, you kind of have a distribution, if you will, of those points. And mathematically, we can derive from that some what's called control limits. And I'm not going to go into the math. I am familiar with it, but it's not important. It's mostly important to understand that we have a target range in which, if this process or this practice is considered in control, the data points will lie between the upper and lower control limits and not fall outside of that. So you can immediately see that these three data points here are outside of the defined control limits. And so if you think of those as a change practice, then so long as our changes are consistently meeting the expectations in our organization and not falling outside of those control limits, then we want those changes to flow freely. If we fall outside of those control limits, we want to analyze, well, why is that? What went wrong? How can we improve the end-to-end practice to make sure that we're more consistently meeting those expectations? Now, hopefully you recognize that this is really good old-fashioned standard distribution, right? And with your standard distribution, you also have these sigma intervals here that, again, you try to target. Most things will happen under here, and if your process is in control, you don't have these outliers left and right. And so long as your changes are aligning here within this area, then we're in relatively good shape. So that's a little bit of math to apply to the concept of change control or change enablement. So how do we set change outcome expectations? How do we turn that into something that we can actually do? Well, that's where the change policy gets dusted off, and it becomes less of a statement of intent and more of a very specific, measurable, actionable, SMART goals of this is our expectations for changes within the organization. And I say it's value stream specific. It could be even more than that, but the idea is that your change policy has to define, or should define, what is the organization's outcome expectation for changes in these various areas. So if you have, for instance, your order processing system, that has a set of change outcome parameters for uptime, availability, recoverability, those kind of things that matter to that part of the business. Maybe your web applications have different hours of the day or whatnot, or maybe you have some back office functions that may have different parameters or maybe in a different situation. But the idea is that the organization has to define those change outcome expectations. As a CIO or as a change manager or somebody in IT, it's not up to me to define what those are. I can suggest them based on my experience. I can suggest that, hey, these are fairly impactful things, but the point is whatever we're doing in change management has to align with the outcome expectations of the organization, and that's critically important. Let me add one point that just arose in the last day, and that is that change outcome expectations include things like if the organization says all changes have to be documented, all changes have to have a rollback plan, all changes have to have been tested prior to implementation. Those are change outcome expectations that the organization sets. And change control or change enablement has to make sure that they're being met consistently within the value stream. It's not that we're doing away with that. It's that we're adapting our change practice to meet whatever those expectations of the organization are for that. And then we start talking about enabling changes, right? So that we're making sure that those changes are achieving those desirable results. So CAB, or the change practice, elevates it from being a nuts and bolts of watching changes go by and becomes more of an oversight or even a governance function, if you will, to make sure that all changes through all value streams are consistently meeting the expectations. And that means that it can happen within those value streams at the velocity that that value stream is designed for. So it's not a mismatch or a bolted-on, spigot, a faucet at the end of a high-velocity hose. That just doesn't work. All right. So we talk about being adaptive and risk-based change control. And so this is where that blast radius thing that you saw in the briefing on this session comes in. So when we look at a value stream, that's a value stream right there, right? And we start at trying to bolt on some what I call telemetry, or a way of understanding how well this thing is performing. And these are just examples. They're not descriptive for what you may need to do in your organization. But if we look at things like, well, what is the performance of this value stream with regard to failed changes? And what's the business impact to the organization of failed changes in this value stream or resulting from changes in this value stream? You know, things like incidents and problems or major incidents or other things associated with that. To what degree is this value stream or the services that it serves isolated from others in the organization? In other words, if there's a failed change or a poor change or something that happens in this environment or served by this value stream, does it affect other systems, maybe the entire system? And so if you're looking at, making infrastructure upgrades in your data center or major, cloud provider reconfiguration things, that is probably not a well-isolated kind of failure, and it has a different risk profile, and you want to be able to understand that. And so that's where we talk about this blast radius, and you understand the idea of, a little explosion makes a small crater and a big one makes a big crater. And it's a way, particularly in software development, they've adapted that whole blast radius, like how bad is bad, right? So we're going to talk about that in another one. But recoverability becomes a key component too, and that's not generally recoverability. That's specific to this value stream. If something goes bad in this value stream, how quickly can it be recovered? Okay, so let's talk about a graphic that I've used for a while about this, and the idea is that a small diameter blast means that whatever bad thing that happens, let me go ahead and put this on here, whatever that bad thing that happens, it's happening in a very small part of the business. And you know that in the application development world, we've engineered now where we can install a feature or a piece of code that may not even go live until the switch is turned on, or it could be isolated to a very small part of the system that if it goes bad, then a very, very small part of that system is impacted. That's how people like Facebook and the major online providers, they are very well isolated like that. So changes typically only affect a very, very small section. The other piece is the recoverability, which we'll say a little bit more. But as you go out into larger rings, as changes have the potential to impact an entire system or perhaps multiple systems or maybe even the entire organization, then your blast radius becomes very, very large. And the impact to the organization when you ask things, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, the worst thing that could happen, perhaps you recall in March of this year, Facebook was offline for 24 hours. Now, that's a lot of time for a provider like Facebook. And you think about that, that's not just an impact to grandma being unable to see baby pictures. There's advertisers who are paying tens of millions of dollars a day to get their ads in front of viewers on Facebook. And so those customers of Facebook were not particularly happy. Followed the press around this, and I'm not throwing them under the bus. The reason it's kind of a big deal that Facebook was down for 24 hours is because they're never down, because they're doing a very good job of this. But in this case, the blast radius of that one change that was done to a single server and cascaded throughout the organization became an enormous blast radius that actually affected the stock price and the public perception of the organization and impacted stakeholders and customers, paying customers and whatnot. And so the question then becomes is, were we aware that the blast radius of this particular change could be that large? Chances are probably not. And so we ask ourselves, well, what is actually at risk? And the reason this is important is when we start understanding the nature of a particular value stream, then we can adapt what we do with regard to change control or review to the risk of the changes that are going through. So a minor feature added a menu item or whatever. I won't even try to make stuff up. But if you're making minor changes and we have the ability through build automation and deployment tools to pull that back out within 2 minutes, and we've tested that and we know that that's true, then the potential impact of a single change going badly is very, very low if you think in terms of business impact. The feature went in, it didn't work, we pulled it back out, no harm, no foul, 3 minutes, and we've moved on, right? So that you handle very, very differently. Those kind of changes you want to flow at maximum velocity. But if you have a change that is a major new system upgrade or a major implementation or maybe a new system being stood up, one, we don't know what the value stream looks like in terms of its performance, and two, it's a very, very large implementation, we might want to handle those in a different sort of fashion. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about blast radius. Now, I've made a couple of mentions of recoverability. So this is the elusive undo. Like, we did a change, we really want to go back to the way it used to be. So we think in terms of time to resolution or restoration. We think about, well, what is the complexity of the environment? I've actually worked in some organizations where there is actually changes that can be implemented that really can't be undone. And those are very challenging and very problematic because now you're engineering on the fly if that change goes badly because you can't simply undo it. And so understanding that, understanding what's at risk, gives us the ability to put the right level of diligence and review onto that and other similar changes. And also, what's the maturity of your operations? And I don't mean the people, I mean of the infrastructure operations and our ability to be resilient. So if we have a well-engineered multi-site cloud, et cetera, and we've tested it and we understand what its resiliency and its recoverability, then we have a certain level of confidence versus potentially other environments. And the other thing is, how much of the business is being impacted by this? What are the business processes that are being supported? So if you're supporting the general ledger or the order processing or the billing systems, then the cost of or the impact of the organization of an hour or two of downtime can be rather large. Maybe you recall that Target stores in the U.S. were down for about 2 hours. Their ability to process payments was down for 2 hours. The analysts, and this is all in the public, this is not me making this up, estimated that the financial loss to the organization in those 2 hours of downtime was about $50 million in revenue that they will never see again, and that impacted their stock price as well. So when you think about the impact of, and that was a change-related failure that caused that one as well. So when you think about, it's not just do we have stable systems and are IT people good, but what is actually at risk? When I make this change, does my business management know that we may not be able to process credit cards if this goes badly? And if so, are they aware that this is the right time to do it? This is the appropriate business cycle. Maybe you don't do it during the holidays. Maybe you don't do it on weekends or whatever. The business needs to be part of that decision. So let's see. So you see that risk is comprised of these three kind of major components: the impact or the blast radius, the recoverability, and then a good working knowledge of the track record of the value stream. That's how we understand what the risk associated with a change is, and that helps us make good decisions about how we're going to handle changes from a practice standpoint. All right, so because you all recognize, and maybe I should have shown this earlier, but you recognize that one printer being down has a vastly different impact than all of your point of sale devices being down. You recognize that, and you would respond differently. We do organizationally. We respond differently when, you know, a senior executive can't print their document or a knowledge worker isn't able to print a report than when we aren't able to process customer payments. We recognize intrinsically that those have a different profile and different business impact. So here's the tools of change control. They're going to sound really, really familiar to you because they're the same tools that we've been using for a long, long time. But let's talk about how we use change authority, standard changes, and change models. So change authority really has to do with, well, who can authorize a level of business risk. And in the old days, we used to say, who can be, who's going to get fired for having made that decision, which is actually the wrong question. The question is, who can make this decision, and if it goes badly, who won't be fired for making that decision, because that's the person who has the authority to put the organization at that level of risk. And you understand that it's a hierarchy that generally, we want to delegate as much change authority as low as possible within the organization. And that's why it's really important that we understand what the profile is of the value stream, what the risk is of the change that are flowing through, and the potential business impact or the blast radius. That helps inform what level of authority can be delegated to what levels within the organization so that the right people are making the right decisions. But most changes, frankly, we've engineered them down to where they're really low risk, or relatively so. And if they go bad, we can recover quickly. And those kind of changes can be pushed down to a very, very low level. But here's the thing. It needs to be very, very clear to everybody involved who has the authority to approve those changes. When you have, well, did it go to CAB? Did it go to a senior VP? Did it go to a supervisor, an operations manager? In kind of this ambiguous, we don't know if we have the right level of authority, then it becomes actually worse. So it needs to be incredibly clear, which means it probably ought to be relatively simple. And so you recognize, you see the thermometer goes up. As the risk goes up, then we understand that the authority for approving those. So we have to look at what the risk and the impact is. What are the business cycles? Can we approve an off-cycle change during a month-end or year-end close because that change is so damaging to the organization, or does that require a higher level of approval, right? And they have to consider the benefit versus the risk. I'm familiar that in the good old days, your change management capability would frequently say, this has a 40% likelihood of failing, and so this change is denied. The business perspective on that, and this is an actual case that I abstract a little bit because I don't want to protect the innocent here a little bit. The business says, but you're saying there's a 60% chance that this change will be successful, and from a business standpoint, that's a risk that I want to take because that's important to my business what this change will do. And so we have to understand from a business perspective what we're trying to achieve. Zero defects is not the goal. The appropriate level of risk that's well managed within the outcome expectations of the organization. That's the goal. And of course, your track record, your recoverability, those things are also important. When your risk gets really, really sky high, then of course you have to think about, well, how big is this impact? Is it just a single system? Is it multiple systems? Is it the entire organization? Is it one branch office? Those are the kind of questions that need to be considered, and as you can understand, that's a pretty high level of decision-making authority. It needs to go up to a higher level. All right, so let's talk about standard changes. Most of you know this. I'm sure that you know about it. They're standard, they're documented, they're pre-approved. I'm adding that it's important to understand that it has a demonstrable track record for all of those change outcomes that I defined on slide number 2 or 3. We need to understand how this standard change impacts these, because otherwise we don't have a context in which to make a decision to delegate that down to a standard change. And we have to make sure that they're delegated to an appropriate authority level, because a standard change is actually simply saying that this decision for this change is being made by, in some cases, operational staff or line staff that are actually doing the changes. But you have to make sure that the risk matches the authority level. And of course, they're typically documented in the normal change tracking tools, because standard changes tend to be one of those areas where if you're trying to do incident management, or particularly major incident management, you may not be aware of changes that happened in the environment because they were standard changes, and we may not be able to map its impact. The other piece being, in some organizations, and I'm just going to say it out loud, you may or may not recognize this, but in some organizations, standard changes are code word for bypassing change management. So you say, yeah, that's a standard change. And it's actually not a standard change in terms of it's meeting the risk profile associated with those things. It's simply a way of bypassing or gaming the system so that we don't have to play mother may I. So you have bigger problems if you're in that space, but recognize that that's not the idea of standard changes. Change models are pretty straightforward. It's an approach. It's a standardized approach to a given change type, whereas the parameters might be different, but how we actually do that. Let me give a quick example. Back when we all used to have data centers, we used to decom servers that we would physically remove a server, take it offline. And we would do that on a fairly regular basis. Well, a couple of times, you ask the questions, is anybody using it? Is anything still pointing at it? No, no, no. We took the thing off, moved it down the hallway, and then a couple hours later, oh my gosh, we have business impact of this. And it's like, turn that thing back on. Well, it's not a matter of turning it back on. We have to go down the hallway. We have to push it back into the data center, power it back up. And it took a long time to recover it from that. So one of my engineers said, hey, here's what I would like to do. I would like to define that our practice is when we actually say we're going to decom a server, we actually just literally turn off the network services so it's functionally off the air. And if we do that for a day and we don't hear any impact, we'll actually power the server down, leave it in the rack. And if after a day we don't hear anything from that, then we'll actually go in and unrack it and put it in a staging area. And it was a brilliant scheme, and that became at our cab that we were practicing at the time is if you're decomming a server, we expect you to follow Michael's process. And if you're following Michael's process, our ability to restore that thing, if there really is, in the unlikely event that there's a challenge with it, we can restore it. And that's a good example of change models. Change models can be a lot more mature than that. In fact, you can even view your application development methodologies or your approach to developing changes to be a change model itself. When you have a high degree of automation, a high degree of consistency in your process and your practices, those models are actually what we're looking at to understand their operating parameters, and that's partly why they're powerful and effective. All right, so you see that delegated authority, standard changes, and change models work together to form an adaptive practice around changes. The really, really cool thing is when we do this, changes are being managed in the workflow. We're completely agnostic to however you're doing. If you're doing DevOps, great. We'll work with that. If you're doing Agile, great. We'll do that. If you're doing traditional waterfall, or if you're a group of server admins that just do what makes sense to get things done, we'll work with that. But the idea is that it matches the workflow velocity of the work that's already being done. And we're working to optimize what we do in conjunction with that. It's not something that we do to them. So that brings us all the way back to this slide, which I'm not going to read to you again, but this is one of the things I now want to point out to you is if these are the goals, if these are the objectives that our capability is trying to do, you notice that it doesn't specify any particular processes in here. And it's not that processes aren't important. Every organization needs processes, and effective processes make for effective service delivery. But the idea is that we have to focus in on the right things. That when we get change management away from focusing on nuts and bolts and follow the process and whether may I and did you get CAB to approve it, and focused on, well, what are we trying to do with achieving that, then we start being focused on making sure these things are met. So I promised that I'd come back and say more about GRC. Well, documenting your changes and following certain processes can be part of your GRC expectations. And in as far as that is required in your organization, then you have to make sure that the value streams are performing that work. So we're not doing away with your RFC tracking. We're not doing away with your workflow tools that so many of the tools vendors are very, very good at. We're just simply saying if you're doing something because of a practice, because we've always done it, or because one size fits all, that's not a good enough reason. You need to know why you're doing the things that you're doing. And if you're doing them for a very specific reason, because it's in policy, because there's a compliance issue, or because there's an operational expectation of your IT shop that you will have visibility and those kinds of things, then that's why we're doing it, and we're doing it consistently and meeting those expectations. But we're adaptive because if we don't need to do those things, then we're not doing unnecessary work. And I think that brings us pretty close to, that's your lessons learned, and I'm going to hand it back to Roy at this point. I saved ourselves a few minutes. We have some questions, I think.
We do indeed. Thanks, Greg. Some good questions here. So first one, how is the increased scrutiny of information security impacting the transition to change enablement, specifically with not adding a Q stop in the process?
Yeah, that. So every time I open up the questions, you guys ask really good questions, and that one gets you right in the heart, because at the time that the practice of change control is trying to loosen up and accelerate its flow through the organization, we all are face to face with this information security thing, and the risk level associated with that is extraordinarily high and growing every single day. So in my view is you're not going to bolt on information security, and information security is not going to be fundamentally increased by quote unquote bringing it to cabin. Let's take a look at that thing and make sure it's there. My view would be that information security, just like every other feature, needs to be engineered from the beginning along the way, and whatever expectations around that need to be met are part of it that's happening in the workflows. For instance, you expose them to vulnerability scanning or validation testing or those kinds of things. There may be a requirement organizationally, a change outcome expectation, that all coding changes have to go through a review of some sort. Whatever those expectations are that are tied to specific outcomes, either defined in policy, NIST, et cetera, within your organization, need to be part of the process of moving it forward, and not a mother may I checkpoint at the end. It's actually, now I'm going to forget the name of the document, but there's a NIST document that is wonderful that talks about how you do software engineering, and I recognize that it's not all about software, and engineer security into it. It's a massive document. I met the author, but her focus was on the same thing, is that you can't inspect information security into an application after the fact. You have to engineer it in through the process. So change control then needs to be focused in are we doing that, and do we know that we're doing that? Are we validating it? Are we checking it? Are we following accepted industry standards for information security implementation within the value stream? There's a lot more to that one, but you've hit a very key point, and that's where we need to elevate information security to being explicitly stated as a change outcome expectation, that we don't release an application that has unmanaged risk to the business because of information security not being considered in the development and deployment of that change.
And I think maybe, Greg, that's where the concept of DevSecOps comes from.
It does.
Okay.
I've not spent a lot of time in that space, but the idea is simply that you can't just code it and throw it. I'm sorry, that's probably offensive to somebody who's doing app dev, but from an operations, of which I've been most of my life, from an operations perspective, that's essentially what it becomes. And it doesn't matter how quickly you're delivering that or how slowly you're delivering that. If you're not following the appropriate practices, then you're going to produce unsecure or unstable or inappropriate services out the back end. So you have to make sure the right things are happening, but you also have to know why it is that you're checking for those things. I always ask people that engage in a debate about these things is, how fast would you drive your automobile if it had no steering wheel and no brakes? And of course the obvious answer is not very fast. And the reason is because we're afraid we'll make a mistake and run something over. Right? So if you want to drive fast, you put the right controls in place so that you're able to effectively control that vehicle to achieve the outcomes that you want. And that's why it's really important to make sure that we have the right controls in place. We're not going to just move at velocity because that's what the cool kids are doing. We're moving at velocity because we know that we've met our expectations. We know that we're achieving those outcomes. Not we think, or we hope, or we pray, but we really know, we've validated that that's in place. And that's really the focus of change control is, are we achieving these things? If so, move them at velocity.
Thank you. What do you recommend for awareness if there's no CAB?
So, and I'm going to make the assumption that by awareness you mean, does everybody who needs to know that a change is occurring or has occurred actually knows? And I worked in technical support, help desk, whatever we called it back in my day, which is a long time ago. And it's so incredibly true that the service desk is the last one to be told, but the first one to know that a change happened and didn't go very, very well. It's incredibly disrespectful as a profession, but it's incredibly impactful to a business in terms of business risk. We slowed down time to resolution. We damage customer experience and customer satisfaction. There's so many factors associated without all of the right people knowing what's happened, that it's happened. So most of, and I really avoid tools discussions, I'll tell you, but it's becoming really, really hard these days to separate good practices from good tools. So I'll let you decide what good tools are, but many of the really solid ITSM tools have a great workflow and visibility for managing changes, and they're improving them and aligning them with the emerging practices, so they're going to get even better. Communication and visibility doesn't need to happen in a meeting. It just needs to. What is the interface between the development and the support community, or the development and the infrastructure or server teams, et cetera, is what are those interfaces? What are the expected communications between those? When will they happen, and are they happening consistently? So there's a lot of engineering that needs to be done there, which is all great. I can sense that there's probably a sense of, that sounds great, Greg, but what do I do in my organization? We're not doing that engineering, and we're just trying to get by from day to day, which is the world that I inhabit in my day job, is that we don't have the time or the resources to engineer those things. So we build things in. We use good people to say, and I regularly ask my team, what can we do without spending $1 million to improve the communication? And so it's kind of refreshing the approaches that we have to make sure that people have the information. And probably because I'm highly sensitized because of my background, I really don't like people not knowing what they should know. Information should be made available to everybody who has need to know, so that they can do their job, and also so that they can feel like they're part of the team. Nothing makes you feel like not part of the team more than, I guess I'm not a cool kid. Nobody told me what's going on. And so openness and transparency and communication, in my opinion, would be part of the value stream. It needs to be engineered into the value stream. The notifications that go out when things are moving from stage to stage, notifications that go out when things are released, a what's changed portal, which is some of the tools are starting to do that kind of stuff, where it's like, your service day start of shift is look at the change console and see what's happened, that sort of thing, what CIs have been touched, that sort of thing. I might not have, in my contact information is there. Feel free to reach out to me. I may not have fully addressed that, but there's not a magic bullet. There's certainly not a magic solution to that. But I would say that get change not focused on being the point of communication, and get change focused on, well, who needs to know, and how is that happening, and is it happening consistently, so that it becomes more of a continual improvement oversight. It's like, why didn't they know? Why didn't these people why weren't they aware? And let's solve that problem. Let's put some people to work on solving that problem.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left. Where does change management fit within an Agile, Scrum, Kanban setup?
So I'm not going to be able to answer that in 2 minutes, but what I will say is Agile, Scrum, Kanban is a value stream that, when done well, and I've seen some incredibly well done ones, it matches very well. It is literally the epitome of this value stream that I'm defining. And change management then needs to attach itself into the right points so that it's assisting that value stream. It cannot become obstructive. It cannot become a separate and distinct organization. It simply ties into that value stream. So I talked about Sprint or Scrum planning in the presentation, and the idea is change control is aware that these changes are going in the hopper, and they're aware that they're coming out at the far end, and they're watching what is the performance of those changes. Are they achieving? Are they failing? Are they being rolled back? What's the business impact? And so compiling that information and being one of the, if you're familiar with DevOps, one of the feedback loops that inform the value stream, hey, we have some opportunities for improvement here. And quite frankly, we're not meeting our change outcome expectations, so we have an obligation to improve that. So that's how they work together. It becomes, Dr. Forsgren and Jess Humble made a presentation at DevOps Enterprise Summit, I think it was in 2017, where Jess Humble referred to that CAB needs to morph into, or change management needs to morph into what he called a governance function, meaning more of watching it from the big picture and less about the individual nuts and bolts. And I like that description. I think it's very poignant to get us focused at the right altitude.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. Really appreciate it. And don't forget to download today's deck. If you need to reach out to Greg, you had his contact information there, and you can revisit the webinar when it comes out in the recorded fashion, which will be very shortly. This webcast is copyright 2019 by Informatech. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by HDI, which is solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of HDI, thanks for your time and have a great day.